Hello, I'm Abram Vanningen,
And I'm Joanne Diaz.
and this is Poetry for All.
In this podcast, we read a poem, discuss it, learn from it, and then read it one more time.
And today we're joined by a special guest, Rafia Zafar, to discuss Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, We Wear the Mask. Rafia is professor of English, African and African American Studies, and American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author, most recently, of Recipes of Respect, a great book about African American food cultures, but also the author of We Wear the Mask, African Americans Write American Literature, 1760 to 1870. And since Rafia is a wonderful colleague and friend of mine with an office just down the hall, we thought it would be great to have her join us for a discussion of Dunbar's famous poem, We Wear the Mask. Welcome to the podcast, Rafia.
Hi, thank you. I'm delighted that you invited me.
Would you be willing to read this poem for us?
Oh, absolutely. We wear the mask, Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I have a question just to get us started, which is you've got a book that's about African American literature in the century basically leading up to this poem. This poem was published in 1896.
Exactly.
And it's called We Wear the Mask. And I'm just sort of curious how you landed on that title for the African American literature that you study. And maybe to explain that would help us as a way to get into this poem itself.
Yes, certainly. I was studying with the late and great intellectual historian Nathan Huggins because I thought I was going to write on the Harlem Renaissance, and I eventually did. But in reading his study, Harlem Renaissance, I came across We Wear the Mask, and Huggins is using that from the poem as a metaphor for how much African American creatives, writers, artists were masking or putting on a different, allegedly more mainstream face in order to gain an audience. And one of the questions was, he said that he posed, and of course that the writers themselves were posing, is at what point are you unable to take the mask off? I can't remember what horror movie there is, but that is the horror of it, right? At some point, you find yourself unable to speak in your native language. You find yourself unable to look like the way you were. You're wearing the mask, and the mask can't come off. So a literary strategy I saw in these early authors, whether it's Wheatley, whether it's Frederick Douglass, whether it's Elizabeth Keckley, is writing in forms that are visible, that are knowable to a white mainstream. They could forward their sort of political agendas, their psychic agendas, their pleas and demands for equality and equity, and under the guise of writing what we could then think of as mainstream literature. In the end, I conclude this is where Dunbar comes in particularly, because I think this was the tragedy. It's a tragic irony of Dunbar's life, is that but with the fall of Reconstruction, when the gains of the Civil War and the acts following the Civil War were dashed, African Americans realized that polite or literary strategies weren't necessarily going to work, and they were going to speak to each other more. And this is around the rise, and there are a lot of interesting young scholars working on this today about on the rise of Black print culture, Black newspapers, Black publishing houses, and then African Americans really started speaking in a way and writing in a way that a white audience wasn't necessarily expected or even
Mm,
desired. And then
mm,
we have the Harlem Renaissance.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of a long answer.
Yeah, no, that's
Oh, it's
great.
amazing. Yeah.
Can you say more about this tragedy of, in a certain sense, of Paul Laurence Dunbar as you understand it? Because I mean, in a way, he did have a national audience and even an international audience at that time, at that very time. So he was born in 1872. He died young and at the age of 33 in
Yeah,
1906, and he had a huge audience. And yet, we there is a kind of tragedy. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
absolutely. Absolutely. What brought him to fame, big fame, were the dialect poems. Poems that harken back to the plantation lore, the plantation myths, and these were popular because the language was in a his rendered vernacular, which to the ear wasn't if you're a linguist, it wasn't exactly accurate. I mean, he was
Mm,
from Ohio, though his parents were who had been enslaved. His parents were from Kentucky. It fed into the sort of the rising myths that we know, right? The South may have lost the war, but they in many ways won the cultural war, right? The
hmm.
romance of the South when, African Americans were actually pretty happy to work for whites without pay, they had a room and board, etc. And Dunbar's shot to prominence, not for something like sympathy or we wear the mask, the ones that are in quote unquote standard English, using traditional rhyme forms, but it was the ones that, with titles like When Melindy Sings or Little Brown Baby, that was a tragedy because he wrote beautifully. You could say he was a poetic code switcher.
Right.
Mm.
Um, and it was the poems that people believed, right, that probably were the way Paul Laurence Dunbar really talked. Of course, he didn't talk like that. He was from Ohio. He was whatever. He was top of his class. He worked on a newspaper. So, on the one hand, he was highly educated, he was discovered by mainstream poets, but on the other, people didn't they weren't clamoring to hear more poems like We Wear the Mask. They were clamoring for
Mm.
more poems like Wendy Cornbread's Hot.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So it fed in many ways to what we now call the trope of the happy slave. This
Mhm.
idea, this sense of oh, enslaved people were actually happy. Look at how much they smile. Look at how much they sing. And it's precisely those tropes that he's unmasking in this
Mhm.
poem. And
Yes.
so there's a way in which you could imagine a poem like this, We Wear the Mask, as almost apologetic in some ways for his own career, or at least a kind of reflection on his own career.
Yeah, yeah. I actually think it's one of those, hiding in plain sight poems where
Mm.
I think he really is he really is speaking. I mean, this debt we pay to human guile. I mean, he is addressing the difficulty of having to speak in particular ways with some of his poetry, or the way African Americans, even after slavery, right? I use this idea, Hartman's justly famous phrase, people were still living in the afterlife of slavery, which meant deference to whites. So you had to grin, right? You had to lie and say, oh, yeah, everything's just fine. And it's I guess, the resolution, right? People who are coming out of, a Christian beliefs that at least Christ hears us, right?
Mm.
You understand us, and at some point we will be rewarded. But it is, I think I'm thinking of James Weldon Johnson's, right?
Mhm.
The what's often called the Negro National Anthem, right? But still, that road we trod is stony, right? Stony the road we trod. I'll try not to say. I'll start singing, but people always inch away from me, like on assemblies and stuff when I would sing because I can't carry a tune. But that's those are that he's toggling back and forth between knowing how hard it is, but equally knowing that in order to go forward, at least in the 1890s, in the early 20th century, people had to dissemble.
You're talking about his personal suffering and disappointment, but he
Mm-hmm.
uses a collective we. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
so interested in when poets choose a we perspective, because this is such a short lyric expression, but it's a collective expression of this bitterness and disappointment. And he's using a very specific poetic form. On this podcast, we haven't talked about this form. It's called the rondo. And I wonder if we could talk about how choosing a form like this can actually contribute to the content of the poem. Abram, do you want to talk about this?
So a rondo comes out of 15th century France, and a rondo can have a variety of different forms in and of itself, but we have a very classic form here of the rondo. If you look up rondos in dictionaries, they'll often give this poem in English as an example. And what a rondo does is it takes the very first beginning of the first line, and in this case, we wear the mask, and it makes it a refrain. So you'll see the we wear the mask happens there. We wear the mask happens at the end of the second stanza and at the end of the third stanza. And so every rondo will have that. The other thing a rondo has is it has only 2 rhymes in it. So here we have the A rhyme is lies, eyes. And we'll talk about how subtleties is not quite a rhyme with that, even though it looks like a rhyme with that. Sighs, cries, arise, otherwise. That's the A rhyme. The B rhyme is all the aisles, guile, smile, while, vile, mile. So there's only 2 rhymes. And the refrain, we wear the mask, is not a rhyme with either one of them. And that's classic rondo too. And then the last thing to understand with this is that the rondo is classically 3 stanzas. A 5-line stanza, which is what we have here, a 4-line stanza, and a 6-line stanza. And the refrain is the beginning 4 words or 4 syllables, and then it comes back at the end of the second stanza, end of the third stanza. So in every way you can imagine, this is a very classic rondo. The thing about the rondo, though, and this goes back to the long history of it, is that it was meant to be, in a certain sense, a kind of song and dance. It was a c'est la vie. It was a live and let be. It was a kind of a fun and a kind of a playful form out of French. And so you have him picking a form that is about giving a song and dance to people. He's basically choosing a form that is a mask and letting us see behind it at the same time.
And if I could just jump in for a minute, as I hear you describe the form, Abram, my head is spinning because it is so restrictive, right? It's so hard to fill all of those requirements of the form, but he does it in such an incredible way.
I think it's worth looking at that 5th line. So we have, this should rhyme with lies and eyes. The first 2 lines are, we wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. Then the 5th line should rhyme with that. It says, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Not subtleties, subtleties. And I was listening to Kevin Young, the great poet and critic and writer, talk about this poem. And he says, that's the moment. That's the moment where just for a moment, with that off rhyme, that slant rhyme, that rhyme that doesn't quite rhyme, where the mask slips, where he shows on purpose that the mask is constantly slipping and that it constantly has to be put back on.
I like that. And the dance makes sense to make another kind of sense to me because, for example, if you think about the tradition of blues music or just music in general, and that's often a tension in African American cultural criticism, right? Often writers feel that their work is not as deeply imbued with a Black consciousness as music. There's something about music that can transgress and escape the linguistic modalities of English, like having to work in like an anglophone mode as opposed to music which transcends, it transcends language, obviously. But when you think about blues musicians in particular, and I'm thinking of people who've written about it like Shirley Ann Williams or Angela Davis, that the whole notion of the singer, right? So we're thinking about singing and dancing, and Black performance is maybe an I on stage, but they are standing in for the we. So there's kind of a metonym, or
Mm-hmm.
synecdoche, depending on
Yeah.
how you're shading that metaphor. But the we stands in for the whole people. So then Dunbar is deliberately, implicating himself in the community. He doesn't say we African Americans. It's implied by, certainly it's understood by your African American audience reading this, that the poetic persona, the individual, is speaking for the communal.
When I look at that first stanza, we wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. It's such a painful first stanza because um, we have that old cliche of eyes being windows to the soul. But those
Hmm.
windows are shaded here that we can, they can't be accessed, right? Because they're wearing the mask. And then the smile, which ought to be an indicator of joy, is actually masking a tearing and a bleeding. It's a very difficult first stanza.
Hmm.
And then that transitions to the second stanza. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. I wonder if we could talk about that second stanza and the question that it sets up and the kind of
Hmm.
resignation and bitterness that answers that question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at that point, we're thinking about the turn of the last century, and we're thinking, this is the period of in U.S. history that the historian Rayford Logan has referred to as the nadir, meaning,
Hmm.
the lowest point in U.S. race relations.
Yeah.
So, Dunbar's acknowledging that. It's like, why? So why should we let them see the trauma that we are living on a daily basis? We don't need the people outside to see how much they are hurting us,
Hmm.
right? Darlene Clark Hine has written about the culture of dissemblance, particularly talking about Black women,
Hmm.
right? That it was imperative to dissemble. It was imperative to hide your feelings, right? And Zora Neale Hurston talks about that in the beginning of Mules and Men. Present what she calls the featherbed resistance, right? So people
Mm.
don't know what's going on inside because it's not going to help you. Right. If anything, it's going to hurt you more if you know and they know how much hurt and bitterness and anger you're carrying.
So
Mm-hmm.
the mask then becomes an essential form of self survival, of survival, of protection
Hmm.
of the self.
Yeah.
And this second stanza really interests me because that question, why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? I can almost imagine the situation that preceded this question, which is perhaps Paul Laurence Dunbar is speaking to those who might say, why not articulate your grievances? Why not say
Hmm.
exactly what's upsetting you? And he's basically saying, why should I?
Hmm.
That has been tried and it's an exercise in futility, right?
Right. Right. Exactly.
Rafi, I'm curious of what you're just saying there about the turn, especially in the late 1800s and so on, towards a kind of Black audience speaking to a Black audience. Because in some ways, the turn from stanza 2 to stanza 3 is a turn of
Hmm.
audience.
Yeah. It's a different audience, right? We smile, but
Yeah.
oh, great cries. Our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. And the whole notion, right, of clay, the clay is vile. That's saying that, the earth, the
Yeah.
daily, like living on this plane is is vile, right?
Yeah.
It's
Right.
awful. But, if you believe in an afterlife, someone is hearing us. It may not be white Americans, right?
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
We do have an ear, and that's why we can sing. That's why we can smile. We wear the mask so we can have these dreams, so that we can have these beliefs, so that we can continue on that road.
Mm-hmm.
So then that means that the mask is not just protection, but an insistence on survival too. And I only say that or ask it because I'm seeing that exclamation point at the end. What do you think of that choice to make this an exclamation? It's very interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that emphatic. We wear the mask.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways Dunbar is saying we're going to keep wearing the mask
Yeah.
until we can put it down,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if we don't wear the mask, then we are going to be, vulnerable for the slings and arrows, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll be vulnerable. But the mask, you can think of it as it's a mask and it's a shield.
Well, with all of that said, Rafia, would you be willing to read this poem for us again?
Sure. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to Thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but, oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you for inviting me.
For more information about Paul Laurence Dunbar, please visit our website at poetryforall.fireside.fm.
And you can also subscribe to Poetry for All wherever you get your podcasts. And please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Thanks for being with us, Rafia.
Oh, thank you again. It was a pleasure.